Thank you, Yves, for that kind introduction, and thank you also to the organizers, Celine and David, for inviting me here to discuss our research with you this afternoon. So the title of my presentation, as you can see, Conversion of Methane to Methanol over Copper Zeolites. And I'll try to touch upon some structured performance relationships for this process. So a brief outline of my presentation. So there are three topics I'd like to discuss with you today. And the first one deals with research we did a couple of years ago, where we were interested in the nature of the active copper species responsible for this reaction and the nuclearity of these sites in particular. The second topic is what happens if we choose other reactants than methane. And we are not super creative, so our obvious choice here was ethane. Third topic is investigations into the reactivity of the surface-bound intermediates that are formed from methane. And then towards the end, a summary and perhaps some directions where we can take this chemistry further. But first of all, I'll do the acknowledgements in case I run short on time. And this activity started about 8 years ago and has been carried out within the framework of a Center for Research-Based Innovation that Yves mentioned, that has been funded by the Research Council of Norway and industry partners. And here I acknowledge many people, but I would particularly like to highlight Pablo Beato at Topsø, Silvia Bordiga and Elisa Borfecchia in Torino, and several colleagues in Oslo, Uni Olsby in particular. And also beamline staff at different beamlines. So without people like Wouter here, for example, it would be very difficult to carry out some of the research that I'll show you now. Okay, so the motivation for studying the methane to methanol is, of course, obvious to all of us. I mean, we want to avoid flaring of natural gas, and we want to use our natural resources in a sustainable and efficient manner. And the problem, you all know this as well, I mean the products of methane are always display a higher reactivity than methane itself. So you can convert methane to methanol, but you'll have a very hard time avoiding converting that methanol into something else and much less useful, like CO2. And this is also something I'll come back to. So what is it that we do when we convert methane to methanol over copper zeolites? Well, this is a stepwise reaction procedure. So the first thing is to activate the copper zeolite at high temperature in oxidative atmosphere, oxygen atmosphere, for a prolonged period of time. And this leads to the formation of copper-2 species, copper-oxo species within the zeolite framework. Second step, we lower the temperature and introduce methane, which then reacts with these copper species, and this leads to the formation of some kind of surface-bound intermediate, shown here as a methoxy group. At the same time, simultaneously, the copper is reduced to copper-1. The third step is to extract the product. We extract these surface-bound intermediates as methanol using steam, and then repeat. So I have some more details here, and I'd like you now to focus on the timings here. So what you'll notice is that we treat in oxygen for a fairly long time, 2 hours in this diagram. Then we cool down, purge with inert for half an hour, then load methane for an hour, and then extract for an hour, and so on. So this is fairly slow chemistry, and the site times yields are not good. So in terms of process viability, we are not really there. And so this is a chemical looping type process. It's not a catalytic reaction. If I should happen to talk about catalysts and catalysis, then that would be a slip of the tongue. This is definitely chemical looping. But the advantage, the upside of doing it this way is, of course, that we never mix the oxidant and the methane. So the consequence there is that we are selective. We produce methanol with high selectivity. Another consequence of this stepwise operating procedure is that the usual tools and terminology that we, conversion and so on, they are not so easily applicable here. So how then do we report the data? So I show here performance data for a series of copper zeolites, data recorded in Oslo, and what I express here is the productivity. So the number of moles of methanol that we extract relative to the number of moles of copper in the reactor. We can also express this as a yield, for example, in micromoles of methanol per gram of material, which is also useful, but of course that makes it more difficult to compare across different copper loadings. So what we have done is to investigate a series of different zeolite framework types. We've looked at different copper loadings, and we've tried also to look at different positionings of these copper species within the zeolite frameworks. We've also compared aluminosilicate zeolites to silico-aluminophosphate SAPO type materials to look into the polarity of the frameworks. And we've employed a whole variety of different methods to try and understand and probe the materials here. All right, let's get started on the first topic, so the investigations into the active copper species in the zeolites. This is work done primarily by Michael Dybala, now in Stuttgart, Elisa Borfecchia in Torino, and Dimitrios Papas, now working in industry in Norway. So the first thing we did was to look at the series of copper mordanites prepared from commercial mordanite zeolites. And I'm sure many of you know, but I show the mordanite framework here, which has these well-known 12-membered straight channels, and then we have these very oval, barely accessible, these are highly compressed 8 rings, and of course these well-known side pockets that protrude along the side of the 12 rings here. So these are performance data, so the productivity, moles of methanol per mole of copper for a series of copper mordanites with different silicon to aluminum ratios shown in parentheses and different copper aluminum loadings. And what you see is that for most of the materials, productivity here is approximately the same across a range of different materials. However, there is this one particular sample that stands out, that does substantially better than all the others, where we produce around half a mole of methanol per mole of copper. And we've reproduced this performance many times by starting with the same commercial mordanite, introducing copper, and then measuring performance. However, if we try to synthesize a mordanite ourselves, try to make it as similar as possible to the commercial mordanite, then introduce copper, then we get a more regular, ordinary material that sort of falls on the line here. So we think, or our hypothesis was that there is something particular with this one mordanite sample, probably having to do with how aluminium is distributed in the framework. All right, so how can we then try to understand this better? Let's turn to X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and what I show you here are Zane's spectra for 4 of the materials on the previous slides. These materials have been treated in oxygen at high temperature, and then we record the spectra. And these spectra are very typical for a copper-2 type dehydrated species, which is what you would expect following that kind of pretreatment. We see a slight variation in the white line intensity, so the maximum intensity here, and that has to do, and that difference in white line intensity scales with the productivity of the materials. And the white line intensity has to do with the copper coordination environment, and we see this reflected also in the second shell in the X-AFS part. But the performance I showed on the previous slide is measured in the lab, and these data are recorded at the synchrotron, where we are limited in time and cannot perform sort of endlessly long experiments. So that means that the performance and the characterization are done at different conditions. So we redid the performance measurement at the same conditions as those at the synchrotron, shown here with shorter activation times and shorter methane loading times and so on. And we observe a lower productivity at this reduced compressed protocol, but the order of the activity among the materials is the same, showing that the characterization is indeed relevant here. But how then can we understand this better? Why is this one particular sample better than the others? So we then turn to high quality X-ray absorption spectroscopy. So this is high energy resolved fluorescence detected XANEs. And what we've done here is we've selected two materials, the particularly good one and another one, and we've activated in oxygen at high temperature. And on the left here, we have for comparison the data recorded when you heat up also to 500, but now in inert gas in helium. And then we employ multivariate curve resolution to try and deconvolute and understand this procedure. So what that does is that it gives us these 5 spectral components that we use to analyze the global data set. Then it is up to us to use our knowledge of the system, our familiarity with the spectroscopy and the chemistry, and also the temperature evolution of these species to try and understand what these spectra represent in terms of chemical species. Some of them are easy. I mean, the blue spectrum here is clearly a fully hydrated copper-2 species. The yellow, no. The red spectrum is a self-reduced copper-1 type species. The green one is a partially dehydrated copper-2 species. And then we have in black and orange 2 copper-2 species that differ in the temperature interval at which they undergo self-reduction in inert. So when you heat up in inert, copper-2 tends to become reduced to copper-1. And what you'll see here is that the black copper-2 species is self-reduced easier than the orange one. And these are the same data now recorded in oxygen. And you'll see that it is the orange species and the black species that dominate the end state in oxygen here. And we'll have a closer look at this here on the next slide. Yep. So this is the distribution in the end state after oxygen activation at 500 degrees. And what we see is that there is considerable variation among now 4 samples. And what we also noticed is that the productivity of these materials, so the amount of methanol we get out per copper, scales very well with this orange, or perhaps golden component that you see here. We can make a plot like this, showing very nicely that the moles of methanol is strongly related to this one particular copper species. And also we see that the slope here is 1/2, which to us strongly indicates that we are dealing with a copper-2 type of active site here. And the materials here is a range of different copper morganites, but there are also some data in here for the same copper morganite, but activated differently. So this is, to me, a pretty robust correlation. But what then are these copper species? I mean, we are pretty confident it's a dicopper site, but that could still entail many different possibilities. So I show a couple here. So what are they? And we heard several very nice talks this morning in the theory session about the complicatedness of the copper speciation in zeolites. And I've selected here a handful of very recent papers from this year that all discuss how complicated the copper speciation in zeolites are. I mean, do we have copper peroxosites? Do we have bridged mono-mu oxosite? Or any number of other possibilities. In this first paper, it is discussed how the nature of the active site, so the nuclearity, local bonding, varies across different zeolites. The second paper here discusses whether or not it's possible to turn over more than one methane molecule per dicopper site. I mean, if you have a peroxosite, at least on paper, you can do 2. But these three last ones here, they talk about how the copper speciation is influenced by the aluminium distribution within the zeolite framework. And this is a very interesting topic, and it's also a very difficult topic. It's difficult to control where the aluminium goes, and it's equally difficult afterwards to find out where it is. Nevertheless, we and others have tried, and I show some results here. So what we want to achieve here are synthesis structure performance relationships. So in the title I talked about structure performance relationships, but it would be so much better if we could understand and control the synthesis so that we would have these relationships more directly rather than having to do a lot of characterization in hindsight to figure out what we have done and what kind of material we've made, like I just shown you for the Mornites. So what Sebastian Prodinger now at Topsø did was to look into the Mornite synthesis. So Mornite is a completely inorganic system. There's no organic structure directing agent to help you out. But in this first attempt, Sebastian varied the aluminium source in the synthesis. So he compared sodium aluminate to aluminium sulfate. And then through a very multi-method and complementary characterization based on size-discriminating base molecules like ammonia and propylamines, drifts and NMR spectroscopy, and also infrared with different probes, he was able to show that for some of the materials, the aluminium has a slight preference for being in the 12 rings, whereas in others, with the sodium aluminate, the 8 rings are somewhat preferred. And this in turn influences the productivity. Now the study is based on more materials than the two I show here, but I mean this is an example where we indeed see that the synthesis procedure and probably the aluminium distribution influences the performance here. All right, we explored then the Mornite synthesis further. And the next step, or the next attempts by Sebastian, were to vary the mineralizing agents. So trying to compare potassium hydroxide to sodium hydroxide. And then we can start out with the characterization of the as-synthesized materials, so the ones where potassium and sodium are still in the framework. And these are different Fourier maps of the as-synthesized materials from X-ray diffraction that show us the location of the extra framework cations. And what you'll notice there is that for the material made with potassium, there is a slight preference for the alkali cation to be here in the 12-membered ring, just at the entrance of this, this side pocket I talked about. Whereas for the sodium, there is an enhancement here and true symmetry here, in this very, very narrow, nearly inaccessible 8 ring I also mentioned. So, of course, if the cations are distributed differently, then we would like to think that the aluminium is also differently placed. So let's now look at characterization of the proton exchange materials. So we now exchange out the alkali and we characterize the proton materials. And so these are toluene uptake curves. And what you'll see is that for the materials that were made with potassium, the potassium isn't there anymore. It's exchanged away for protons. But you'll see that these materials are saturated by toluene well before those prepared with predominantly sodium. So the alkali cation has a lasting effect that we see also in the proton material. This is not, doesn't have to do with the size of the alkali cations. They are not there anymore. So what then, and this has to do with what has been known in the literature for decades. So this is referred to as small port and large port mordenite related to the toluene adsorption or benzene adsorption capacity. So what then does this mean for the productivity in methane to methanol? And I show you here two extreme samples. So in green, a material made with potassium, and then in the darker color, one made with sodium, and the performance displayed are quite different. So we see that the potassium material, so in our case, for our data, the small port sample, tends to outperform the large port mordanite for any given copper loading. So again, we see that indeed the aluminium location is important here. All right, second topic. What happens when we replace methane with ethane? I give it away in the title here, but anyway, I'll show you the data. So this is work done by Caroline Kvande, who is now doing a postdoc in the US. So the experiments are pretty much the same. We activate in oxygen at high temperature, load ethane, now at slightly lower temperature, and I'll come back to why. And then we extract product with steam. And what we do see is ethylene, not ethanol in this case. So it's not exactly the same as the methane case. We see also small traces of other products. We see a little bit of CO2, we see some ethanol, indeed, and a little bit of diethyl ether, and perhaps some C4. So how can we understand this better? So we looked at a series of different materials, and what we see here is the ethylene yield for these different materials. So for a pure proton material, we see nothing, and that's good. We need the copper, right? And then for copper on an amorphous silica alumina, again, very little product formed. So we do need the particular confinement and the particular effects offered by the zeolite framework. Cerium-5, another zeolite, can also do this reaction. So it's not only limited to mordanites. And here we compare a series of different mordanites. And there are a couple of things that are slightly different here compared to the methane case. For example, the sample I talked about before that outperformed all the others for methane now falls perfectly in line. So that's one indication that this is not exactly the same. And also shown here is performance for a copper sodium mordanite. And for methane, the copper sodium materials tend to do less well than the copper proton materials. But here for ethane, this distinction is lost. So similarities, but not identical. So then we turned to IR spectroscopy to try to understand a little bit better what's going on. So what we did was to activate a proton mordanite and a copper mordanite at high temperature in an IR vacuum cell, and then we dose ethylene, the product. And what we see for the proton zeolite are gas phase features, so ethylene in the gas phase, but we also see these features here below 3000 reciprocal wave numbers, which are very typical for oligomers. So in the proton material, the ethylene oligomerizes very quickly. If we now look at this self-reduced copper mordanite, we see the features of the gas phase species like before, but now there is no oligomer formation. So there is something about the copper here that prevents the oligomerization, which is probably why we get ethylene at that high selectivity and not a mixture of all kinds of further products. We then employed X-ray absorption spectroscopy here also, and what I show now is a temperature-programmed reduction experiment. We first activated the sample in oxygen, and then we cool it down, introduce methane or ethane, and then heat up. So we have the methane results here and ethane here on the right. And this is the rate of reduction of copper. This is the CO2 production. And in the bottom panel, we have the consumption of either methane or ethane. There are several things to notice here. So first, we see that the ethane is consumed earlier or at slightly lower temperatures than the methane. So higher reactivity. And we see the same in the reduction of copper, although not super clearly in this plot, but I have other data and other plots that demonstrate this very convincingly. Another thing to notice is that for methane, all of these three events seem to occur in the same window, whereas for ethane, there is a big tail or a lag here, in particular in the CO2 production, which leads us to think that in this TPR experiment, the ethane undergoes several steps before it is converted finally into CO2 that we detect, which is perhaps not so strange for a larger molecule with an internal CC bond and so on. So with the information available at the time, we tried to speculate on the mechanism, and we ruled out the direct dehydrogenation, because we do need the 3 steps here. We do need to carry this out in a cyclic manner. And the question is really if this is completely analogous to the methane case or not. I mean, do we form, instead of methoxy, now an ethoxy intermediate, which is released as ethanol and then dehydrated into ethylene? And because we did not have any in situ data, and because we did see ethanol and also diethyl ether, we leaned toward this idea with the ethoxy ethanol ethylene route. However, almost at the same time came a contribution from Van Boekhoven's group, where they did show very convincingly that there are significant differences here. So through in situ IR and in situ NMR, Van Boekhoven demonstrated that the ethane and propane undergo an oxidative dehydrogenation following this bottom pathway here, which has no ethoxy intermediate. So this top one with the ethoxy is less likely. So once the ethane or propane, they looked at propane also, is dehydrogenated, there is formation of a tightly bound pi complex that protects the olefin from further reaction. And that part we also saw, but since we did not have any in situ experiments, we were blind to these things in the middle here that Van Boekhoven very nicely elucidated. All right, third topic, which has to do with trying to observe the surface intermediate formed from methane, and this is work done primarily by Bjørn Solheim-Lie, who graduated just a couple of weeks ago and now works in a startup. So the question is really, what would happen if we, instead of steam for the extraction, use something else? If we use, let's say, ethylene or propene or benzene, would we then get the methylation product? So propene, butenes, and toluene. So the experiment was essentially the same, and we attempted all 3, so ethene, propene, and benzene for the extraction, following otherwise a very similar experiment. So we'll do it in order. We'll do the ethylene first, and this is the product distribution seen when we do this experiment using a standard copper proton mordenite. And we do see that the C3 dominates here, which gave us some optimism. Perhaps this is a methylation product, but then when we looked at the proton mordenite with no copper, we see that the ethylene has significant reactivity on its own. Same for a copper sodium mordenite, and also when we skip the methane step altogether, we see products. So we can normalize this, and we can throw more samples into the mix, but the conclusion is that this is a very indecisive experiment. So we then turned to labeling, where we used carbon-13 methane here. So we loaded carbon-13 methane for several hours and then analyzed the isotopic composition, shown here on the left, of the toluene. And what you see here is that not the toluene, the propene. What you see here is that the propene has exactly the natural abundance of carbon-13. So this is a very conclusive experiment. No real methylation going on in this experiment. We then looked at propene, which perhaps was not necessary with such clear results for ethylene, but here we see it is even, so the propane is even more reactive. So here we see hexene, so dimer production, really no matter what, and we also do see coke formation in this case. So third attempt, how about benzene? So the benzene cannot really dimerize, so this might work better, and indeed it turned out that third time is the charm. So here, when we use again the standard copper mordenite, we see toluene as the sole product in the gas phase, showing that we can pluck out these methoxy groups using something other than water. Proton morganites, no product. Copper sodium morganite, also no product. So we do need the proton sites in this case. Without methane, also no toluene formed. So these blank experiments are quite satisfying. Other copper morganites can do the same, and also copper cerium-5 can do the same. But interestingly, we see only a fraction of toluene compared to methanol, only around 1/3. So that, of course, opens up for all kinds of interesting experiments to probe these surface intermediates. All right, so we did see here that it is indeed possible to react these adsorbed intermediates with something else than water. We used benzene to give us toluene. And for me, that's a really good result, because to be honest, for several years now, we've tried with IR spectroscopy and NMR, worked a little bit better, but still to see this methoxy group, and it turns out to be very difficult. And now we have a relatively straightforward chemical experiment that we can use and develop to probe these intermediates further. Especially since we, with the benzene, saw already now that we can't access all the methoxy, assuming that we can access all with water. And we think, of course, that this has to do with different steric environments for the copper and methoxy species, but it could also be a distribution in the intrinsic reactivity of these species. So how then can we move forward with this chemistry? So I have a few slides here I'd like to discuss with you towards the end, but how am I doing on time, Unni? Because the timer stopped at 20. 1 minute. Then I skip most of this and go to the cherry on top, which is a paper here by Yuri Roman's group, where they, and now they do catalysis. It's continuous co-feed of methane, oxygen, steam, and benzene, with a multi-component material like Nerskov and also Van Boekhoven has suggested. So the copper chabazite converts methane to methanol and releases it slowly. Once in the gas phase, that methanol comes in contact with benzene and the proton zeolite and is methylated to toluene. And this provides a way to overcome this conversion selectivity limit that I talked about in the beginning, that you cannot have high selectivity and high conversion at the same time. This is ordinary methane to methanol. This is the combined system, which displays a completely different curve here. And I think this is a very promising approach that we could explore further. So we have indeed learned much about the copper species, and in Oslo, in our projects, we feel that we can explain our observations, assuming a dicopper site, but of course there could be other possibilities with other samples, because I hope I've highlighted to you that these zeolites and with aluminium and then with the copper afterwards, it is a quite complicated thing. It's complicated to measure precisely what we have, and it's also difficult to predict the outcome of the synthesis. So it is a complicated system to work on. And we saw that we could use other reactants than methane, but I mean, we can use our imagination to think about further possibilities here. I mean, it doesn't have to be a hydrocarbon, right, that can react with these active copper species. And then at the end, we saw this attempts at breaking this conversion selectivity limit that I find very encouraging. All right, very last slide. I'd like to remind you about the upcoming EuropaCat conference, which will be in Trondheim in Norway next year, August 31st to September 5th. We really hope to see all of you there. Thank you for your attention.